Hi everyone, my name is Shannon McCracken, and today we will be starting our journey at looking through music, choral music and ensemble music specifically, throughout the ages. Today we start with, wait for it, the Middle Ages. Okay, so let's get into it. We're looking at choral music and ensemble work. How did it develop? How did it change? How did we get to where we are today? So we're starting with the Middle Ages, which is like roughly 476 to 1450. So about 1,000 years. And a lot can happen in 1,000 years. And a lot did. So we're gonna look at 5 elements of musical style in the Middle Ages, and then we're gonna go through a few genres and look at musical examples together so that we can see what was developed, what was created, how did it evolve, and then you'll have a kind of a clearer picture of where did we start and then where did we go. Okay, so let's jump in. The 5 elements that we will be covering and talking about that are really major in the Middle Ages are 1, texture. We start the Middle Ages in monophonic texture. Mono means one, and so that means that there's only one melody line, one voice. There are not multiple lines, there aren't harmony lines, there isn't music supporting it and beneath it. So we start with monophonic texture, but by the end of this time period, we end with polyphonic texture. Poly means many. So at this point we have 2 or more voices, 2 or more melodies, there's instruments, there are a lot more layers happening. So that's a really, really big thing that was developed and created in this era. The other thing we'll look at is notation. Nowadays, we get sheet music, we can read it, we know that the notes tell us what pitches to sing. Is it high, is it low? The notes tell us how long to hold that note for. Is it 4 beats? Is it 1.5 beats? When was this created? In the Middle Ages, which is really cool. So notation saw a huge development in this era. It was like literally born. So at the start, we were passing music down orally, but by the end of it, we were able to notate these compositions so that they could become more complex. We could read them. There's a system in place for us to notate, record, and pass along. Melodic range. So at the beginning of this era, the range was really narrow, really small. Because we have the ability to notate, everything's becoming a bit more complex. We end the era with larger melodic ranges. That's a really huge development that happened. The 4th thing, rhythm. This kind of runs parallel with the idea of notation. Because we've created this system, we can now create more complex rhythms. We can be accurate. Things are now measured. When we start at the beginning of this time period, things sound really free because they're unmetered. Now, at the end of it, they are metered. Things are much more structured. And the 5th element we'll be looking at are music genres. We have 2 main genres here. We have sacred genres. A lot of music was written for the Roman Catholic Church because it was such a huge part of most people's lives at the time. Then we also have music in the secular genre for outside of the church. And so we will be looking at both of those areas. So those are the 5 big elements of musical style in the Middle Ages, the key ones. And now we'll jump into some musical examples and start looking at genres. Okay. So the very first genre we are looking at is Gregorian chant. So Gregorian chant served as functional music in the worship services of the Roman Catholic Church. It was originally passed down orally, but it was among the earliest forms of notated music in the Western tradition. So there are some characteristic features of the Gregorian chant. And we're going to listen to an example and you'll notice that it's monophonic texture. There's a single line, one melody, no other harmonies, no instruments beneath it. It's modal. What does that word mean? Okay, this answer really is targeted to how much you know about music, but today we live in a major minor world. Most music is based in a major key or in a minor key. That system wasn't created yet. So we have these different types of scales. They're called modes. These scales are what these chants are based on. They don't have a tonal center. If you don't know what that means, as you listen to the piece, just ask yourself, does this sound like something I've heard recently that's current? Does this sound major or minor or other? Major being happy in quality and minor being more sad in quality. So just take a listen to that. It might just sound different, and that would be because the chant is based on a mode, on one of the church modes. The range, it's very narrow in a Gregorian chant, and the melody moves by step or a very narrow leap. There are no large grand leaps yet. This is not a thing that happens yet. So everything's really, really narrow. Also the rhythm, it's unmeasured. We don't have a way to really notate it quite yet. And even when we started notating, I like how I'm gonna say we a lot as if I was there. I was not. Even when we started notating though, we hadn't created the language yet to be very specific with the rhythmic values. So you'll notice it sounds really free, it sounds unmetered, and it is unmetered. The melody is sung freely with the natural inflections of the text. So it has this really nice free kind of movement and flow to it. And then it's based on Latin texts. So Gregorian chant, it's religious, it's for a sacred setting. Okay, so before we jump into this piece, I want to talk about 3 different text settings, 3 different ways to set the text. The first one is syllabic text setting, and that's where one syllable receives one note. That's it. I am going to the park today. Every note receives one syllable. The second text setting is pneumatic text setting, and that's when one syllable can receive roughly 2 to 4 pitches per syllable. I am going to the park today. Okay, really exciting stuff here. The third one is melismatic text setting. That's just a really fun thing to say. So a melisma is when you have one syllable with a ton of notes. So melismatic text setting is when for the one syllable you have a ton of notes. It's certainly not that complicated. It sounds though impressive. It's the most elaborate and florid way to set text. So the piece we're listening to is Gregorian chant. The composer is anonymous. It was written in the early Middle Ages. It's from the Mass, which is a part of the Roman Catholic Church's service. The source of the text is from the Psalms in the Old Testament. Again, it's religious. It's Latin in language, and the texture is monophonic. Now, in the example I give you, you'll see that it can be soloist and chorus. So it's responsorial. So we have a solo person, and then the chorus joins in and responds. In this recording, I believe it's just a chorus singing. So let's take a look at the music. Okay, so if you take a look at example 1.1, that's how the original notation would have looked. You can see these little squares. It's starting to show you a direction of pitch, but it's not overly specific. Now, example 1.2 is a modern transcription of the whole entire chant. So that is what you can follow along with if you know how to read music. Again, you'll notice it's not metered. There's no time signature. That's not a thing yet. There's no rhythmic values. So let's have a listen. go. So that is our Gregorian chant. Now, that is going to influence the next genre that's created. Okay, organum, that is our next genre. So the chants, you know, they could have been sung for months, for years, maybe even generations. And in that time, somebody had to try something new. So they did. And what they did is they started to experiment with the chant. So in very simple terms, it's kind of like the musicians started to harmonize with the chants. What? Harmonizing? That wasn't a thing yet. Okay, so they started to harmonize with the chants and thus creating polyphonic texture, where we have two or more voices at the same time. So it started pretty basic, where they might have been moving in parallel motion with the chant in maybe open fourths and fifths, but then it could get a little bit more complex. And the example we're looking at is slightly more complex. So the very earliest form of polyphonic texture can be found right here in organum. It began as an improvised practice and it evolved over several centuries. So the piece we're looking at is based off of the Gregorian chant we just listened to. So the Gregorian chant we just listened to, you'll notice it's in the bottom line of the music. It's in the lowest voice, and the line above is new material. Okay, so let's have a listen right away. So again, the genre is organum. The composer's anonymous. This one was written in about 1175. The source text is Latin from the Old Testament and the Psalms still. And the texture this time is now polyphonic. There are monophonic sections to it still. And the number of voices, 2. Okay, so I'm just gonna jump into it and play it for you. Okay, so it keeps going on like that. You're welcome to look it up yourself. You can YouTube it, you can check it out on Spotify or really anywhere you get your music. That is a lot different than the Gregorian chant. There's a lot happening. Whether you like it or not, it has progressed, right? So that lower voice is containing that borrowed melody, and you might notice that that lower voice is holding those long pitches for a really long time in comparison to the top voice. That's right. All of those notes that are in that chant, the original chant, they're augmented, they're longer. And then the top melody is really moving quickly. There's a lot of rhythmic variety compared to anything we've heard thus far. And the most common harmonic intervals still in these voices are perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves. So it still has, to the ear, if you're listening to the interval quality, it still has kind of an open sound to it. That's organum. So we've gone from Gregorian chant, monophonic texture, to organum, where we go, what? Polyphonic texture is created? That's nuts. And then we are now going to go to motets. Okay, so for motets, the organum Haec dies contains extended melismatic passages in the upper voice, right? There was a lot of fluid moving rhythmic patterns just for one syllable. And that made the existing text like really difficult to follow. And the upper voice kind of awkward to perform. It feels a little, it's not my favorite, I'll be honest. In the 13th century, musicians dealt with the situation. They went, oh, we created this. This is a little awkward. What are we going to do about it? So they dealt with it by adding new texts to the previously textless upper voices of the organum, making the upper part easier to sing. Also really interesting, as a singer, if you are given a ton of notes and there is no text for those notes, it's really difficult to memorize them. Text really helps us kind of Velcro in those pitches. Now they've added text, a new text to these voices. This was a factor in the development of the 13th century polytextual motet. So if I say motet and you have something very specific in mind, it might be a motet from the Renaissance era or something. So this is where it started. So it might not be exactly what you have in mind when I play it for you. So again, this is coming from, it's really hard to understand the lyrics, it's difficult to sing, it's a little awkward. Oh, okay, let's add new text to the top line. That'll make it better. Hold that thought until after I play this piece for you. So the characteristic features are, it's usually in 3 voices. The bottom voice is still containing that original chant. And the intervals that we usually are singing still are perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves. So in terms of quality and intervals, nothing's really changing there. The upper voices were generally more rhythmically active. That's cool. And they crossed parts. That means if I am a soprano, but if I'm singing the highest part, the top line, it doesn't mean I'm always singing the highest notes. Maybe my part dips down in pitch while the middle line, the second line rises up. So we're singing, but we're crossing parts a lot. This motet created this new term called polytextuality. 2 or more texts heard simultaneously. As a result, the words can sometimes be really hard to distinguish. And a characteristic feature of the 13th century motet is this, polytextuality. All right, so let's have a listen to it. So there's 3 voices here. Remember that they all have their own texts. well. Easier to memorize, easier to sing, easier to understand though. I don't know. So we have polyphonic texture, right? There's two or more voices singing melody lines. They all have different texts. The top line and the middle line, they're sharing the same range and there's frequent overlapping. And you can, if you read music, you can see that in the example and the sheet music I provided. They both share in the rhythmic activity and create the effect of triple meter. And the predominant text setting of the upper voice is syllabic and pneumatic, while the tenor text is set melismatically. The most frequently used harmonic intervals are perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves. Again, that quality that's created harmonically through those intervals, we haven't heard anything really new quite yet. So we've gone from Gregorian chant now to organum to motets. I do want to share a little interesting nugget of information here. The juxtaposition of sacred and secular texts in the motet reflects and foreshadows the emergence of new attitudes to life and art. Because in a motet, you could have a mix of a sacred text being used at the same time as a secular text. Really interesting to note. Also, if you have time, just do a little Google search. What is happening socially at the time a piece of music is written? What's happening with the art, with the architecture? Everything's linked with each other. You're going, oh, this was happening then, and look how it's reflected in the art that was created. Okay, so the very last genre we will be looking at in the Middle Ages is the French chanson. This is a secular piece of music. It's got nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church, this one. Characteristic features of the chanson is that it's monophonic texture. There's one melody line. They're modal melodies. They're still based on modes. Major and minor still has not happened quite yet. It's often in strophic form. So that's when a song structure has the same music that's performed for every single verse of the poem. The interesting thing about a strophic form is that as a result of the music being the same from verse to verse to verse, there's not a lot of connection that can be achieved between the words and the music, like we see later on in other eras, as it's just set. It's that the whole way through. So we will be listening to a lovely little French chanson. It was composed in the mid-13th century. It's a secular poem. It's French, it's by a solo singer. The texture's monophonic, there's one melody, but there is improvised accompaniment on some of the recordings that you'll hear. Okay, even though it's 5 verses long, I am going to read the translation. It's a lot of me talking, sorry. Because it really shows that because it is in strophic form, the music's the same throughout, it really can't convey the changes that happen verse to verse. So, verse 1, it happened in May when skies are gay and green the plains and mountains. At break of day, I woke to play beside a little fountain. In garden close where shone the rose, I heard a fiddle played. Then a handsome knight that charmed my sight was dancing with a maiden. Verse 2, both fair of face, they turned with grace to tread their Maytime measure. The flowering place, their close embrace, their kisses brought them pleasure. Yet soon did they slip together away and strolled among the bowers. To ease their heart, they played the part in love's games on the flowers. Verse 3, I crept ahead, all chilled with dread, if someone there should see me, bemused and sad because I had no joy like theirs to please me. Then one of those I'd seen there rose, and from far off was speaking. He questioned me who I might be, and what I came there seeking. Verse 4, I walked their way to sadly say how long I'd loved a lady, whom all my days my heart obeys full, faithfully, and steady. Though still I bore a grief so sore in losing one so lovely, that surely I would surely die, unless she deigned to love me. Verse 5, with wisdom rare and tactful air, they counseled and relieved me. They said their prayer that God might spare some joy and love that grieved me. where all my gain was loss and pain. So I in turn extended my thanks sincere with many a tear, and them to God commended. Oh. Okay, let's have a listen. It's strophic form. It consists of 5 verses with 12 short lines in each verse. The melodic range is a 9th here. It's nice, the range is growing. Although the message of the text is touching and poignant, the music is lilting and jolly. So there's no relationship between that text and the music. Here we go. Okay, there you have it. So 4 different genres we looked at, and you can see that over the 1,000 years, we've really come quite a ways. The texture from monophonic to polyphonic, the notation, the ability to write down and record, the pitches, the rhythmic values, the melodic ranges are growing, that rhythm, being able to make it more complex, more structured and metered versus free. And then the genres, looking at how music was influenced to be written for the church, and then how was it written in secular settings. That's the Middle Ages. Hope you learned something, and hope you had some fun. I'll see you in the next video where we will be discussing the Renaissance era. Okay,